Hello, everyone. Are we fine? Victoria, yes.
Yes.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session called Parliaments and Pandemics, going virtual and staying open in the COVID-19 age. We have a lot of expectations for this conversation today. So thank you to all the speakers. My name is Maria Barón. I am the executive director of an organization called Directorio Legislativo that has offices in Argentina and in the US. And we're organizing this webinar with the Open Consortium. The consortium is composed of 6 organizations or networks. The Westminster Foundation for Democracy, National Democratic Institute, Parliamentary, ODIHR, the Latin American Network for Legislative Transparency, composed in itself by almost 30 organizations, and Directorio Legislativo. And we're have the objective of pushing the transparency and openness reforms in the parliaments around the world. So the objective of this session is to talk and discuss and show examples of how many of the reforms that have been happening in the different parliaments around how to work in these new times that we happen to be living in. And so this has brought a lot of debates around these institutions that have been, in some cases, created 200 years ago and now are required in a way to work in a 21st century fashion, and how prepared they were or how not prepared they were. And there's a strong debate around the world because many parliaments have not yet stood up to working online or virtual or in different ways to keep up the proceedings. So we're going to talk about that, and each of our 4 speakers will give us their view and their vision about what is happening in the region or in their country. We have had some positive externalities regarding transparency and some negative externalities with this situation. For example, there are countries that now have passed into an online fashion, but and so it's the first time that we see committee meetings and we can not participate, but we can see what is happening, what is being discussed. That's the case in many times, or for people that are not living in the capital cities of where the parliaments are and have the opportunity to hop online and see what they're discussing. We have a lot of course, parliaments that have, stood up to working online, but that has been only up until today and sort of an internal authorization, but they haven't gone. So they have authorized themselves to do it, but they haven't done it yet. And then we have some parliaments that have sort of restricted the agenda to the emergency or to the COVID thematic, and not to all of the thematics that they are used to dealing with. And so we have in most of the countries different situations, and we're prepared to discuss them here in this session. One last thing before going into the interesting part of this, which is hearing what our speakers have to say, and it is around some of the compilations that have been successfully published in the past weeks around what specifically is happening in different parts of the world. So we have, for example, the Interparliamentary Union has done a really great job in sort of summarizing the different ways the countries have been, or the parliaments have been coping and generating creative reforms and ways of working. It's really interesting. On the other side, Parlamentaricas and our organization, Directorio, have done something really similar and creative as well for the Americas region. It's really, really interesting to see all those little initiatives that have been initiated by the parliaments and in some cases by the parliamentarians to sort of continue their work in these times. There is an interesting also publication put out this week by IDEA, International IDEA, with a little bit of recommendations and opinion too in that sense. And also there are, on the flip side, some, I would have to say, petitions from the different communities of the different countries that have locally asked very voicely to their parliaments to step up and start the proceedings, and to do it not only to advance in the agenda, while keeping their track on the openness side, but also to step up to the checks and balances role that they have in the institutional systems that we live in. And so there are many of those. Some are really interesting, and there's many effects that those have caused in the different parliaments. So it's an interesting time. So to go to our speakers, like I said, it's the interesting part of this session. I would like to introduce them all now first a little bit, and then give the floor to each. Our first speakers will be legislator Marc Serret. He is a member of parliament from Canada, and he represents Nickel Belt. He is the chair of the Canadian section of Parlamentaricas as well. So he'll give us an overview of how Canada has dealt with the non-present sessions in these past couple of months. The second speaker will be an MP also from Spain. She's Marta González Vázquez, and she represents A Coruña. She is the deputy spokesperson for El Partido Popular in Parliament, Popular Party, and she has a doctorate in medieval history, which will be really interesting to cross her presentation with that lens. Our third speaker will be a very interesting one as well. He is Leonardo Barbosa from Brazil, and he is the Secretary General of the lower chamber from La Cámara dos Diputados. And he will show us a really creative solution that the lower chamber in Brazil has come up to continue the proceedings in Brazil. One interesting thing there is that it's not that you can come up with a solution in 1 week, and it shows the countries that have been working on that or have been working on that for some time now. And the fourth speaker will be Sami Obeng. He is from Ghana, and he represents the Parliamentary Network of Africa. And his interesting view in this will be from the civil society perspective. So our perspective, how we see from the other side of the counter, how everything is working and being done. So with no further ado, I'll give the floor to Marc Serret, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Good morning, Madam Chair, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be a panelist here for this webinar focusing on ways in which legislators during this COVID-19 pandemic could sit virtually to promote transparency, openness, and really access to information to our citizens. As indicated by the chair, Max Sede, I'm the chair of the Canadian section of Parliamentary. Since 2015, I represent the district in Nickel Belt, which is Northern Ontario, in the House of Commons. I'd also like to acknowledge, as the chair mentioned, a lot of the organizations that put this together, with the Directorio, the National Democratic Institution, the Parliamentary International, and the Westminster Foundation, putting this seminar together under the umbrella of the Open Parliament e-network. Really important to be having this conversation. I was asked to highlight in ways in which Canada's Parliament has adapted its operations in the wake of the onset of COVID-19 pandemic. I will begin by noting that the Parliament of Canada is functioning. Legislation is being tabled, debated, modified, and adopted. Cabinet ministers are being questioned, and some parliamentary committees are meeting. The parliamentary precinct is open to senators and members of the House of Commons, but most parliamentarians are not traveling to Ottawa. Instead, they are working remotely from their homes and the constituent office, where they're located throughout Canada. Since adjourning on March 13th, the Senate and the House of Commons have been recalled 3 times to debate and adopt legislation related to supporting individuals and businesses affected by the COVID pandemic. At present, votes cannot occur without recalling the 2 chambers. On each occasion, a limited number of senators and members of the House of Commons was physically present in order to meet the requirements for the minimum quorum. In each case, the parliamentarians were able to respect the physical distances requirement recommended by the Public Health Agency of Canada. At this point, the Senate is scheduled to resume sitting on June 2nd, and the House of Commons is scheduled to sit with all 338 members present on May 25th. That said, the House of Commons Procedures and House Affairs Committee is meeting as we speak to study the practicality and technological considerations for virtual sittings in the House of Commons. And the final report should be tabled within the next 7 days. When the Senate and the House of Commons were recalled, they adopted motions allowing some standing committees to meet virtually while the Parliament of Canada is not sitting. To date, during these pandemics, standing committees have been a key mechanism for parliamentary oversight and accountability. Currently, 2 Senate and 7 House of Commons standing committees are meeting virtually in order to receive evidence related to the pandemic. Committee members comprise of all the different political groups here in Canada. As well, a motion has been adopted in the House of Commons that establishes a special committee on COVID-19 pandemic. This committee is referred to as COVID. So the COVID membership comprises of all 338 members of the House of Commons, which have been participating. The COVID meets both in person and virtually. In-person meetings are held once a week with a reduced number of members, and time is allocated for questions to be posed to cabinet ministers. Virtual meetings are held twice a week with all members, the 338 members, allowed to attend virtually. This includes time allocated to questioning cabinet ministers. The first COVID meeting was held on April 28th, and its 5th meeting was held yesterday. Then all political parties have the opportunity to ask the PM and cabinet ministers during this committee of the whole questions during 5-minute rotation, questions and answers. So this gives the opposition an opportunity to critique and suggest modifications to legislation and questions during this time, and the public and the media is obviously able to attend and hear virtually these sessions. To conduct virtual Senate and House of Commons sittings, as well as committee meetings, the Parliament of Canada ensures that all proceedings are available in both official languages, French and English. To date, conducting interpretation during virtual committee meetings have been sometimes challenging. At times, the interpreters have had the inability to clearly hear what was being said. Though the translation has been some of the issues, and it's important for each of the members in their official languages to be heard, which sometimes limits the participation in these meetings. Challenges to conduct virtual sittings of the Parliament of Canada include scheduling, since members of the Senate and the House of Commons reside in 5 different time zones, and security online proceedings, since online platforms can be hacked, sometimes of an issue. The connectivity for parliamentarians, since some of Canada's rural and remote areas lack high-speed internet, has also been an issue. So regarding the Canada's Parliament's commitment to parliamentary openness, transparency, and access to information, I want to stress that the commitment continues to exist. I want to thank the public service for, in a short amount of time, for organizing a lot of this technology for MPs and senators to participate virtually. It might also be characterized as not normal times. Committee proceedings and committee parliamentary proceedings are accessible today to the public unless the sessions are in camera. Anyone can watch the sittings of the House of Commons or the Senate online, and committee meetings are televised, webcast, and audio feeds are also available. The online platforms that are being used virtually with Zoom or Skype, everyone, regardless of where they are located, can access parliamentary proceedings remotely, provided that they require the technology available in their community. All pertinent information about committee meetings continues to be available online, such as the time of the agenda for the meeting, as well as a link to listen to it remotely. Canadian citizens, trade associations, civil society organizations, and all types of groups that would typically appear as witnesses to make presentations to parliamentary committees continue today to have that opportunity to participate in the deliberations of the committees that are meeting virtually to receive evidence for the pandemic. As an example, on March 31st, since March 31st, more than 160 witnesses have provided evidence to the House of Commons Standing Committee of Finance. Lastly, as part of the motion adopted by the House of Commons since the onset of the pandemic, e-petitions have also been submitted by Canadian citizens can also be tabled during the Committee of the Whole on a weekly basis in the House of Commons by MPs. It's an opportunity to highlight some of the petitions of our work in our constituents. Also, concerning my personal experience representing my constituents in Nickel Belt in Northern Ontario during this pandemic, I want to note that the main concern of Parliament going digital, and I'll say a few points on that, as indicated, the capacity to adequately translate English to French, French to English, so that everybody could participate equally. All members speaking, from our experience, need to wear a headset, no exceptions. This provides better audio for our interpreters to avoid audio issues. Also, the ability of parliamentarians, as I mentioned, living in remote areas, we need to ensure that we recognize some of the limitations of the high-speed internet. On the issue of remaining connected to my constituents with respect to physical distancing guidelines, I want to note that many of my parliamentary colleagues, and myself included, have held many information sessions with my constituents, with businesses, with local groups, utilizing Zoom. This has been a good opportunity to make sure that the communication and the dialogue and the information that I'm hearing from my constituents are being brought back to government, to cabinet, and parliament. So I want to thank you for the attention, and I look forward to the discussion afterwards with some questions and comments. Again, thank you for organizing this event, and all of you for participating today. Our democratic institutions need to function during these challenging times. Government and legislators can make a difference. It does matter, and we need to continue to support people and the most vulnerable. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Thank you a lot. It was really interesting to hear about the relevance of the standing committee, something that hasn't been, around in the public debate, but it's really true to analyze sort of that part of the functioning of the Congresses, of the parliaments, and interesting to see how you come up with a mixed sort of system of presence meeting in plenaries with some of the members and then virtual with all of the members. The issue, of course, in Canada and in many of the other countries around the translation, which is key if we want to represent well to the communities that we serve, or you serve, not in our case. The stress of the people that are working around technology and behind the clock to make this all happen is something that is, I think, overarching in all of the parliaments. And finally, the issue, a really impressive one, I think, around keeping up with the participation of civil society at the committee level, with the 160 witnesses that you have exchanged with regarding evidence around COVID. I think that is really a strong number and really something that the parliament should look at, sort of the back door or the behind the scenes of how you have been doing it. It's really impressive, I have to say. And that gives me a way to share with maybe some of the people that are with Directorio can share a document that we have shared online the past weeks. It's a simple Excel that the community can add to questions that we've been asking around that specific thing about participation, civic participation during these times in the parliaments. So if you can add what is happening in your country, it's interesting to have a view of the whole world. Most of the countries in Latin America are already, the data of the countries in Latin America are already there, but all the other parts of the world can please do so. And so I'll stop there, and our distinguished second guest is MP Marta González. So the floor is yours. Thank you for joining again.
Thank you. Good morning to all of you. I hope you can hear me well. Greetings from Santiago de Compostela in the northwest of Spain. I wish you are all well and remain safe. I want to thank, first of all, the organization for this occasion to share with you what is and has been the Spanish Parliament experience during this tragic period in the history of our country and the humankind. And I would like to start by paying tribute to the 26,070 victims who died in Spain because of coronavirus so far. Spain, as you know, has been one of the worst hit countries in Europe by the novel COVID-19, together with Italy. Today, figures reach 221,447 confirmed cases, 26,070 diseases, and 128,511 cured patients. After a month fighting, infection and death rates are now under control. Experts say similarities in the pandemia development in both countries have to do with late measures against the outbreak, shortage of testing kits, aging populations, and a similar social culture. You know, we are Latins, we are very, very open, we live outside. In March 14th, the government enforced a lockdown in which shops, bars, restaurants are closed and are still closed. Formal education has been interrupted. Students receive a reduced number of online lessons every day. People could only leave their home their homes unless for grocery shopping, pharmacy purchases, medical appointments, walking their dogs, and going to work, but only those who cannot work from home and perform essential tasks kept their activity. Since last week, a partial lifting of the lockdown restrictions began. Activities such as construction and manufacturing industries have returned to work. Citizens are allowed to exercise or practice sports in the open air at a certain number of hours during the day for the first time in 7 weeks. Small shops such as hair salons, hardware stores, or bookshops opened for the first time last Monday, serving customers by appointment, and along with restaurants for only the collection of takeaways. The return to normal life will be progressive in phases, co-organized by the central government and the regional governments, depending on the region's COVID-19 respective data. The Congress activity was first halted on March the 10th, Tuesday, when all members of Parliament were in Madrid, as the session started that same afternoon and the news spread that one of the speakers tested positive for COVID-19. So it was a bit of a chaos. 2 days later, all activity was stopped after a decision of the spokespersons of the parliamentary groups, a decision that was taken during a telephone conference after a proposal by the presidency. 2 days later, on March the 14th, the state of alarm was adopted in the country and a quarantine for the population and also for the parliament established. For a period of 15 days, all parliament activity was locked. But the role of parliaments is more vital than ever to pass emergency laws, allocate funds, control government action. The Spanish constitution, moreover, provides that in case of adoption by the executive of a state of alarm, it may only last 15 days unless extended by authorization of the Congress. In the event that the government wishes to extend the state of alarm beyond 15 days, which happened already 4 times so far, it must request an authorization from the Congress before the term expires. The decision has to be made in plenary session, and the parliamentary groups can present resolution proposals to the government decision. This legal obligation made the Congress and the Senate open again and start using previous approved measures that have become crucial, such as the electronic registry regulated by a resolution issued in 2008, in which all initiatives by the different groups can be found with all the documents related to the parliamentary process, open all days of the year, 24 hours a day. So it has been already a tradition of working online and at least through the registry. And the same thing happens with the electronic or proxy voting. The procedure for electronic voting in the Congress has been regulated by a resolution issued in 2012. It was meant for parental leave of the MPs, as well as serious illnesses, during which parliamentarians must remain at home and not travel to Madrid. Similar measures apply in the Senate. The procedure was frequently used during these last years by individual MPs, and fortunately, all members of parliament had, before the pandemic, a secure app installed in their tablets and computers for this purpose. A guide has been issued with detailed instructions and pictures on how to proceed, and so far it has been effective. So we can say that neither the regulation of the Congress nor the regulation of the Senate provide for specific measures for the functioning of the body in case of emergencies, but the regulation of the Congress had already approved these 2 different tools that have become essential during this period. There was no need for emergency parliamentary measures, but only already existing and previously approved mechanisms which made it easier and faster. Legal bases for remote working, security and authentication problems have already been discussed and solved at the moment. The Congress has held so far 7 plenary sessions, almost 1 every week, with a, let's say, mixed procedure, as it happens in Canada, as we have just heard. We continue to meet physically, but with restrictions. Beyond quorum requirements, we have minimized the number of physical votes required while reflecting proportional representation for those who attend physically. Fewer parliamentarians, less than 50 from a whole of 350, mainly those who live in Madrid, are physically present. The rest, among them myself, attend the session through their computers and we vote electronically. There is fewer staff in the building. Not only the state of alarm has been voted and approved several times, but also many different laws and decisions with amendments have been voted and adopted. The same applies to committees, where ministers have been, as in Canada, physically called for hearing in order to inform about the decisions made on this period. During these hearings, only a very restricted number of MPs is present, physically present, maintaining proportional representation. The rest are with their computers. The board of the parliamentary committees are holding their meetings electronically. All legislative work is being developed by MPs from their homes and registered electronically. Today is day 55 of our confinement, and we have been already called for next parliamentary session on Wednesday, the 13th. Parliaments around the world are changing practices and procedures in response to coronavirus, and they ought to, because our role is crucial in this pandemic, for the stop of the pandemic, for safe reopening of our countries, for the restarting the economy. Issues ought to be discussed. Governments must be controlled or encouraged. Decisions have to be made, and parliaments should never, ever stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marta. I think it's really interesting, the case of Spain as well, because you show that you have been working around more creative ways before pandemic. And that really shows regarding debate and voting. So it wasn't originally thought for these circumstances. Even you mentioned about the parental leave, you know, a positive externality around this, and the app that the MPs have in their phones. So it has been a really interesting, I think, journey in that sense for Spain, to be able to continue with this mixed fashion, like you mentioned, the same as Canada, of presence and virtual, you know, maintaining the proportional representation. And I think these 55 days of confinement have shown that the path has been thought of by the parliament itself for other reasons, but it shows like a strong institutional development in a way, and that gives way to what you were saying around the role of the parliament in this circumstance specifically. And I agree very much that parliaments cannot stop for whatever reason. They cannot stop their work, because there's a specific role in overcoming this emergency situation. So thank you very much. And now we'll give the floor again to Leonardo Barbosa from Brazil. Leonardo is the Secretary General of the Chamber of Deputies of Brazil. Leonardo is a Doctor of Law from the University of Brasilia and has a postdoc from the University of Michigan Law School as well. And he will also talk about how the Brazilian Congress has made their way to keep on working in these difficult times, sorry, and that I'll leave it there so that I can give you a way to your views. Thank you very much, Leonardo, for being here, and I'll mute myself.
Thank you very much. Well, so let me start by saying good morning to you all, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I hope you all can see and hear me well, and I hope you and your families are all well. Thank you very much to everyone at the Open Parliamentary Network, especially Maria Barón, our host today, for putting together this very interesting webinar on parliaments going virtual at the age of COVID-19. So I believe for those of us working with representative democracy and popular participation, going virtual brings up lots of underlying questions other than the mechanics of a digital parliament. Digital democracy won't solve the problems of analog democracy just because it is digital. So I'll keep that in mind as I try to answer the questions that were previously shared with me by Maria. I'll use them as a roadmap for this presentation, and maybe we can address some of the broader issues later during our conversation. So how is the Chamber of Deputies currently operating virtually? First, let me give you a quick timeline of the relevant events in the House. As we all recall, March 11, WHO declared the coronavirus outbreak a pandemic. And 6 days later, after realizing that measures of social distancing were inevitable and indispensable, the House enacted a resolution sponsored by the Speaker allowing for virtual sessions. So on March 25, we conducted the first ever virtual meeting of the Brazilian Chamber of Deputies. And since then, we have run some 20 sessions and passed some 21 bills and even one constitutional amendment, which was formally enacted yesterday. This constitutional amendment, as reported by the Democracy Spot blog, seems to be the first ever to be approved by a legislative body through online voting. Basically, it allows government more budgetary freedom to face the challenges of the pandemic, creating, however, a way to keep closer track of public expenditure. It also allows Congress and the public to evaluate the fiscal effort that will be required from us all after the pandemic. So given the delicate fiscal situation of the country and the need for a quick governmental response in these times of crisis, I think the amendment was a huge accomplishment by Congress, particularly if we consider that we are still learning how to get along with this virtual session. So what we call virtual session here is actually a hybrid. For symbolic reasons, mainly, the Speaker refused to run the sessions from any other place than the floor of the House. He is usually joined by myself, part of my team, and by some of the party leaders that have chosen to remain working in Brasilia. The rest of the representatives join us by using the video conference app called Zoom. So we actually intertwine two Zoom sessions. One of them hosts the party leaders. There are 28 of them in Brazil, and some are not in Brasilia. And the other hosts the remainder of the representatives, a total of 513. That was important because party leaders have free access to their microphones, whether the rest of the representatives have not. So a party leader can interrupt the speaker at any time, and this provides us with a scenario which is more similar to the ordinary meetings of the House. The official TV channel and all the internet channels of the Chamber of Deputies, they operate live transmissions of the sessions. They are recorded, and they are, of course, easily accessible to any citizen. So although we use Zoom for purposes of video conferencing, all critical activities during the sessions, that is registering in the session and casting votes, they are performed in the InfoLeg app. So the video conference platform is absolutely separated from the data traffic between the app and our internal systems. And that leads me to the question number 2, which is, to what degree have previous experience in terms of digital openness contributed to the legislators and staff adjusting to this new scenario? Well, they have contributed a lot, actually. The Brazilian House of Representatives has long been regarded as a trailblazer in digital democracy, and this accumulated experience was invaluable during the transition. This InfoLeg app is the key to the operation of virtual sessions, and it was a pre-existing app developed in the first place to make it easier for staff and public to keep track of the session. The app already provided information on the representatives and parties, on the House and committees agenda, and on all procedural motions pending on the floor of the House, all amendments presented to bills under consideration, and so forth. So we basically developed new functions that will appear only on the representatives' smartphones that allows them to use the app as a remote station for registering themselves in the session and also for casting their votes. Of course, that took a huge amount of work from several teams, and so lots of security protocols, and we developed ways of handing passwords to the representatives personally. Each one of the representatives has been contacted by a member of the permanent staff of the House that validated the identity of the representative and handed over a provisory password, which was then activated by the representative. The representative's smartphone also passed by an additional authentication protocol to make it really safe. So that leads me to question number 3, which is about relevant weaknesses of this system, which is now in operation. The weak link of the chain is the fact that we use a password to authenticate the representatives during the process of registering and voting. So to minimize risks, the resolution of the House that authorized virtual sessions made it a breach of decorum to hand over the password to a third party, potentially leading to the expulsion of the representative. We are currently working on solutions that will make this procedure even safer, but so far we have not experienced any problems regarding system security. So another issue is that we use Apple and Google virtual stores for distributing InfoLag. That can also be challenging. For instance, by the time we uploaded the app to the stores, the new version of the app to the stores, the time for uploading the apps had been affected by the pandemic. So that alone could have had potentially delayed our operation back in March if it wasn't for the critical help of Apple and Google teams during this period. So thank a lot for them for doing that. So we use this huge private companies to host and distribute our InfoLag app, but it is important to clarify that during this remote deliberation period, we are not taking any secret ballots. There are a few situations under Brazilian constitutional law that require secret ballots. We're not doing it during this time. And the remote deliberation system also works with encryption of data that will not allow a third party to gain knowledge of the quality of a vote during the voting process. So before the voting is actually over. So no one can check how a representative is casting his or her vote during the voting process. This is impossible. So, and we also felt that this option, that using an app distributed by Google and Apple, is actually safer from a cost-benefit perspective than using a web-based service. So that said, let me quickly tackle 2 very important last questions. So the main constraints and risks about going digital, and how can parliaments work around these risks? This will require a lot of empirical study. Usually I come across with 3 main concerns: accountability, the leadership powers, and protection of parliamentary minorities. So on the accountability side, we have a lot of digital services designed for citizens' participation in Brazil. They are operating as always. So maybe the challenges for the representatives to be able to promote citizens' participation during this crisis, when population, of course, their attention is naturally focused elsewhere. And we spend more time using the remote system. And as we spend more time using the remote system, I believe that the participation maybe will happen naturally if we are able to involve people. We also have continued to grant access to information regularly in accordance with the Brazilian Freedom of Information Act. No aspect of the House's operation is a black box by now. And let me emphasize that 100% of the legislative information of the Chamber of Deputies is online, from legislative process documents to administrative and budgetary information. So as for leadership powers, the remote system seems to bring party leaders to the spotlight. During regular sittings of the House, many representatives use the microphone for short interventions in a somewhat free and unregulated way. So this is not a possibility now. As party leaders control much of the microphone time available on the floor of the House, they have become more powerful in a certain way. So, but I don't think this is a problem because we have 24 parties, you know, there's a lot of them. As for minority rights, our experience shows that minorities still able to work a very efficient filibustering in measures that do not have the agreement of the majority of the House, of some part of the House. So this virtual deliberation has promoted a less radical agenda that will allow us for do things more easily in the floor of the House. So the major problem we have faced so far is that our committees are still not working. We have more than 50 committees, and for them to operate simultaneously, that would require a lot of work, and our team just cannot bear it right now. It would be hard to reconcile with our practical limitations, but we are still working on a way to make committees operational as soon as possible. So thank you very much. I hope that these remarks are useful to you all, and I'll be glad to answer any questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonardo. I think you touched on 3 issues that are really important that weren't very much addressed before. The issue about the security and the security breaches, and in what instances that is key and where not so much. So I think that is something that the Congresses and the Parliaments are discussing a lot. So to bring it here, I think it's really interesting. Then the issue about the protection of minorities and also the participation in the debates of issues that affect to them is also an issue of concern in the whole world, and I think it's really interesting also to bring it up because of access to online platforms. That could be sort of the backslide of this. Regardless that in your case, for example, all of the information is online and reachable, but not to everyone. And also a third issue really that I think it's really interesting, and it's a political side or the political effects that all these new sort of way of working brings to the political incentives and party incentives within this political institution, which is Parliament, and around what we were mentioning about who takes the microphone and who doesn't, and how free you are to do that. There, I'm sure, a lot of other effects on the also the ability to continue to create coalitions around specific issues, like before physically, and now that will have to be virtual, and how open or not open that is. So thank you very much again. And so this gives us way to the last, but not least, of course, speaker, which is Sami Obeng. Like I said before, Sami he is based in Accra in Ghana, and he heads the African, the Parliamentary Network of Africa, PN Africa. And so, Sami, please, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you. Thank you very much, Maria.
Sorry. One more thing before you speak. Sorry, and for this point of order. If the people that are hearing this to this session want to add or ask questions, they can do so in the chat, marking the question to all the panelists and attendees, so that we can all see the questions, and then we can make a sort of summary of all the questions that have been posed, and then bring them back to the speakers. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Thank you very much, Maria, and good day to all of you. I'm sure that you're all keeping well and safe. Let me also add a voice to thanking the Open Parliament e-network membership for organizing this. This is an amazing, event to have been brought online for all of us to be able to, share some views and get some thoughts around the issues of Parliament and pandemic, how going virtual and staying open in the COVID-19 age is looking like around the world. And I think that it's some amazing perspectives that have been brought on from Canada, Spain, and Brazil so far. It's been awesome, the kinds of things that are going on in your respective countries. I have learned a lot. I must say that, the topic is very, very critical now, even more than ever, because, as a civil society player, you are always, working with an institution that has, the institution of Parliament that has old traditions, very conservative ways of doing things, over the years. Yet the institution plays a critical role in the democratic governance of every country. And so it becomes very, very critical in times how parliaments around the world could be able to function in these very abnormal times, if I should put it that way, especially also when their works are regulated by constitution. They have their own internal standing orders that gives them restrictions on some of the things that they are able to do and cannot do, so all of these things put together makes Parliament, one of the, to my mind, hard-hit institutions really during these COVID-19 times. And as civil society players, whereas we would want to monitor the work of Parliament and point out what is going right and wrong, we are also very minded about, commending the various parliaments who have been implementing very great initiatives for such a great work, because around these times, these are not very normal times. And for you to be able to keep your heads afloat, very, very good one there. But the good thing is that if there is anything that, parliaments around the world will learn from this COVID-19, which I see as the silver lining in the dark cloud, it is that, parliaments would recognize the fact that, we do not have too many systems to reduce risk in many of the parliaments, and the emergency preparedness of parliaments have been quite low, around the world, and particularly for my continent of Africa, where a few statistics from some of the countries that we've been monitoring, I'll share them with you along the way, and also the fact that it's important that we all start looking at ways where parliaments and representative institutions can start being more resilient, So the silver lining, there are still some silver linings in this dark clouds. I think that Parliament will now be more open and more accepting to civil society players and other advocates who say that e-Parliament is the way to go, having ways to prepare for such pandemics and all of that are the way to go. This is because it's not only COVID-19 that will disrupt the work of Parliament. I mean, we do not all hope that there will be such pandemic of global proportion, in the future. We don't hope for that. But even if there is no pandemic of global proportion, there will still be national, issues, national pandemics or epidemics or restrictions that can affect the work of specific country parliaments. And so this should be a lesson for parliaments to start preparing themselves for what happens if some of these things start rearing their heads, within their respective countries, and particularly for the space in which I work, on the continent of Africa, where some of these, natural issues may come up, and our level of preparedness is important. But even apart from that, it's also important that parliaments will start to recognize that these, virtual ways of doing things in parliament are important, even for MPs when female MPs who, for example, are pregnant, or people who have maternity and paternity concerns, how are they going to be able to still represent the masses who have voted them to come and be in parliament? So all of these things are reasons why virtual must be the new way to go, or parliaments must start thinking virtual, because it is not just about coronavirus and COVID-19 related matters. There are some other things. But if there is one thing that has been proven around these times, and from our checks around, we notice that parliaments have truly taken its place as very essential service in all of these. Parliaments are truly essential services in all of this. I mean, you cannot put down the work of parliament, especially around these times. And we have been studying a couple of national parliaments, reading from such compilations like the IPU compilation that Maria spoke about, and the work that they and all the other partners within the Latin America space have actually put together, and all of that. And some very interesting statistics came up to us whilst we're doing the study of some of the things that have been worked on. So we have looked at about 95 national parliaments across the world, 95 national parliaments across the world. And we looked at this between the period from, the last week of March right through to this particular week. We're trying to look at what some of the dynamics are. And out of these 95 parliaments, 16 of them are actually parliaments within the continent of Africa, where we work. Now, we noticed quite interestingly that 4 out of 5 parliaments, about 80% of all the parliaments that we have actually looked at, sampled, are still operating. So that goes to solidify the role of Parliament as essential service players, even around these very uncertain times. But more important to it is that even the 20% who are not operating, many of them, although some of them are forced adjournments because they don't have, they've not put in place the right response mechanisms to be able to get them to sit. Many of them also are parliaments whose sessions had expired. I mean, the parliament is not in session around this time. And so there was really no need for them to be meeting, which means that majority of parliaments are actually continuing with their work. Even for the parliaments that are not working, committees are sitting, they are still involved in community campaigns, they are distributing foods, they are participating in hand washing campaigns with their constituents, and all of the safety precautionary measures within which COVID-19 is being looked at. But the interesting thing from this 95, national parliaments that we studied show that, 31.58%, so approximately a third of all of these parliaments that are currently sitting have some form of online plenary, sessions existing, which means that majority of these parliaments that we looked at do not have online plenary sessions. And so I'm glad that, the case of Brazil, the case of Spain and Canada, online is ongoing, but it means that the majority of the countries who are not represented, at least on the panel here, are not doing online. And it's important that the lessons from this would help to be able to get them to start thinking about these things going forward. And even for the 16 countries that we sampled on the continent of Africa, only two, Angola and South Africa, are the ones who are actually having some form of remote online sessions around these COVID-19 times. Of course, the others are having physical ones with a lot of restrictions, social distancing, and what have you. But as a civil society player, all of these things come with their own concerns, because to what extent can a member of parliament or the institution of parliament ensure social or physical distancing? This is an institution where the chamber is actually wired in a way where people sit close to themselves. Many chambers are not very large, so you cannot have as much social distancing. What it means is that you have to eliminate some members for them to work remotely while others are in the chamber. What happens to the masses that these people represent? Because remember that ultimately these people are representatives of the masses, who are out there. And so if they are being restricted from parliamentary sittings, then it means that the thousands of people that they represent are also being restricted from parliamentary sittings. And these are things that we need to be looking at, with teleworking. Apart from that, to what extent do you ensure social distancing for a member of parliament who is supposed to represent his people, and in these dying times, he has to go to his people and commensurate with them and all of that, the risk associated with that, for him, the member of parliament, or her, the member of parliament, their own families, and what have you. So all of these things, come to bear when we are thinking about the virtual way of doing things around these times of COVID-19. Now, it is important to say that as civil society, we are looking out for some very interesting things that are going on. You see, there are restrictions around this time. Of course, the public, in many of the countries, the public cannot have access to the parliamentary chamber, so they have to watch remotely. The media has been restricted in some of the instances. We are very concerned about these, instances, and some of the instances they do not have very wonderful platforms on social media or TV for people to be able to watch. So how do we report back to the people that we represent? Because ultimately parliamentary information belongs to the people that these members of parliament are representing. Members of parliament are receiving restricted times to which they can speak on the floor of parliament. That is, to some extent stretched, restrictions in their freedom of expression, and by extension, the freedom of expression of the people that they actually represent. And we need to be looking at these dynamics as well, especially in the hard-hit countries where these restrictions are being implemented, very strongly, and it's affecting the MPs and it's affecting the people that they actually represent. And of course, Maria had said earlier on, the parliamentary agenda has been limited in some of the instances to only COVID-19 related matters, but there are other issues that parliament must be concerned, with. And there are some parliaments that are actually expiring in no time. If COVID-19 continues, it means that all other issues that Parliament are supposed to deal with before their tenure expires will be put to the back burner, and that affects the masses, and these matters are the issues that are actually of concern to us as civil society players. And I'm sure that going forward and within the question time, we'll be able to explore, some of the ways that we can all learn from the good examples and lessons learned from countries that are actually implementing the great ones, because there's no point reinventing the wheels. How can civil society work with the likes of IPU and all and other global parliaments to make sure that the learnings that are coming out from respective countries, we can be able to have people learn from them, so there's no reinventing the wheel, so it is easy to be able to adapt and adopt. We are also concerned about how some members of parliamentary staff are losing their jobs, because their works are not becoming very essential. Of course, these are not necessarily the frontline parliamentary staff like the clerks and the secretaries and the reporters and all of that, but also to the ordinary cleaner, because Parliament is no longer in real session, and so you would not really come in to be cleaning as regularly. You may probably lose your job, and these are people who are vulnerable on a normal. And I think that we need to be looking at these and looking at them and how they relate to even gender, vulnerability, the marginalized group in society, and what have you. So in a snapshot, especially also considering the time that we have to do this, these are some of the concerns that came to mind while we were studying our own statistics of the 95 parliaments that we're looking at, including the 16 from Africa, which is really the area of our concern. Maria.
Thank you very much, Sammy. Just to summarize some of the issues that I heard from you that are really interesting. I think it's interesting to note, like some of the other speakers, about Parliament as an essential service in itself, and that some of the parliaments are, or in Africa, have been working, and going back to the IPU publication, most of them have some sort of workings and ways, but there's still a concern about not only discussing on or working around coronavirus, but also all the other issues that are of concern to our societies, that are in an emergency as well. And I think you pointed out a really strong point regarding the freedom of expression, and I would say also the flip side of the participation of the represented around the ways of the parliament, and in some of the countries it's voided at this point. So I think there are some interesting points there. If you're okay, we will go now to some of the many questions that have been published in the chat. So we've grouped a couple, we've grouped 7 or 8 more or less. So I'll read them to you. Some of them are addressed to some of you, and some are general. And then after I read the questions, I would go in the order that you spoke, so that you can group all the questions that you feel that you want to answer, and then we'll go to the next speaker, and so if you're okay. So the first question is to Marta, and it is just like that. And also one last thing to the public. Some of the questions have already been addressed, so I'll go over those. I'll jump those. So Marta, do you remember what the implementation process was like for the app for remote parliamentary work in 2012? Were there any inconvenience or inconveniences regarding the app use? Because I'm translating this. Do you recall any barriers, cultural maybe, that threatened the digitalization of Parliament's functioning? The next one goes to all. Do you find a virtual sitting is detrimental to the standard of debate that you usually get with the physical presence of your colleagues? Some of the things were touched, but I think it's interesting. To Leonardo, I think you've addressed this a little bit, but I'll post it anyways. Other procedures for online sessions were thought out in connection with the pandemic, or there were previous attempts to validate online system and had prepared procedures before? If so, on what basis? And this number 5 is a really interesting one, I think. Is how can parliaments contribute to the debate whether social distancing should remain versus opening the economic debate and liberty of citizens? And then a second question, the same one, the same person, from the same person. Also, how can Parliament remain relevant in shaping the economic recovery programs in order to ensure that vulnerable groups, minorities, women, youth, disabled persons, benefit adequately and do not fall behind further? That's going to Sammy's point. There's one question to Mark Ferre. Do you think that this pandemic has highlighted the pre-existing issues within the Canadian democracy, particularly issues like inclusion? The person says, I think that even with transforming to a virtual parliament, people who cannot afford having an internet are still excluded. It seems that parliament only appeals to middle-class Canadian. Is there any policies that look at these particular issues in the long term? This is something that Leonardo addressed too. And the last one to Leonardo specifically, but of course, if you want to address these issues, the other ones, you can do that too. The Brazilian parliament is a funny one though. The Brazilian parliament gets chaotic sometimes. Speakers go out of control, yell and talk over each other. How effective is the role of the speaker in managing parliament dialogues virtually? So you touched a little bit around that. And then there's one question that was posed now that I think we can relate to some of the ones that were done earlier. And it's, can you touch on, can you touch on how your parliaments have put forth policies that support the majority of people laid off or impacted by the closure of businesses in your country? Have you focused on physical distancing and keeping only essential businesses open? If so, did you use a gender lens to prepare programs to respond to the economic needs of the most vulnerable? I think these are more directed to Marta and Mark, but the rest can answer as well. So we'll give you a couple of minutes to each to answer, and then we'll go back to the rest of the questions that are being published in the chat. Mark.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Lots of questions. So I'm going to try and summarize. The first component, obviously, this pandemic has highlighted our most vulnerable in our society. So there's no doubt that some of the issues that for our caregivers or our essential workers and retail or in nursing homes, a lot of these workers are low paying and are considered today essential and have to be working. So we have to find ways to increase the salary. So our government has been working closely with the provinces to increase the salary of these workers. It's ironic as we have mechanics or that take care of our cars that are paid higher salaries than we have care workers taking care of our elderly in nursing homes. So we have to look at addressing that, and we have in the short term. Also part of some of the policies, we've provided, in Canadian dollars, $2,000 a month for 3 months for individuals that are unable to work right now. So that was our first bill that was debated in the House and modified. Our second bill was providing wage subsidies to 75% for 3 months to businesses. So to help keep employees working during this pandemic. And also we provided $1,250 for 4 months for students because they can't necessarily get work right now to look at their education in the fall. So those 3 bills have been put in place and have had pretty I mean, it's not the same as Parliament, obviously, physically, but there has been, in all of these 3 bills, modifications by the opposition. So the government has been able to work in a consensus, which is difficult on a consensus basis with all the parties, to get those 3 bills passed by the House and the Senate. So So part of the vulnerability of the internet is last year, for example, our government had worked hard to put a plan in place in the budget for internet access. So we do have an aggressive plan, but because of the COVID, we weren't able to launch some of these measures on the internet. So the short-term challenges right now is because of the COVID, we're unable to roll out some of these measures we took last year to help people get more broadband and high-speed internet access. So we'll have to work on that component as we go along. The virtual settings, I'd like to versus on the short term, like we have a committee of the whole. It's twice a week for all 338 parliamentarians. There's 3 components to these 2-hour sessions. One is there's minister statements, and also, like I mentioned, there's petitions by members of parliament that brought forward, and then there's the opportunity for the parties, obviously via the speaker, to be asking questions to ministers, and those are Q&A sessions of 5 minutes that are back and forth with each of the parties, and the format of the parties is the same as what we would have in a regular question period. For example, during a regular parliamentary session, which the opposition has, the official opposition has some questions, and then the third party, and then the fourth party, and the fifth party has questions, and then also MPs that are part of the government, like myself, could also ask questions to ministers. So that has been working well. I mean, we've had 5 of these virtual sessions, so it does permit people to, or MPs and opposition to challenge the government and improve legislation at the same time. Obviously, all of this is available by the media. And the last point on the security committees have been meeting via Zoom. In-camera committees, there are in-camera sessions. Those are Skype. There's a special license for Skype. So there's an opportunity to make the in-camera sessions more secure. And on the Zoom part for members of parliament, I mean, we get daily passwords. There's a domain set up for all the MPs, personal email addresses. So there's an opportunity with security, and I commend, like I said, the public service here in Canada in a short amount of time to making sure that the 338 MPs are able to participate. It's not the same as being physically located in one building, but it has provided opportunity to challenge and improve legislation, the 3 bills that have been put forward. I'm just trying to see here, and the last point, moving forward on most vulnerable and looking at standing orders are difficult to change. All of our parliaments have some that tradition, but I think this pandemic, has opened up an opportunity for parliaments to think about more inclusion on the virtual side, to make it more family friendly, to ensure that members of parliament that travel long distances, that have young families, that have other challenges, don't necessarily have to be all physically present, and obviously members of parliament that are close to a capital have an advantage versus members that are in 5 different time zones across a country as large as Canada. So hopefully this an opportunity for all of us to continue this dialogue, what we're doing virtually here, to see how can we modify some of the older standing orders in different parliaments. So I think I'm trying to cover some of the questions that were asked. I'll let the other panelists go ahead, and I can come back later on.
Thank you. Marta, the floor is yours.
Thank you. If I understood well, one of the questions that was related to me was about the remote vote and how it was started in 2012, and if there were some cultural difficulties with it or not, and how useful it is right now. Well, it was started, and I think I said it as a way to improve maternal leave at the very beginning for members of parliament, mothers, and then now it is used both for mothers and fathers, and also for MPs that have serious illnesses that prevent them from traveling to Madrid. It works perfectly, and of course, before it affected or benefited 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 people at a time, but now it is working for everybody, so it has been a real change. But I think, and I think I said it before, that all the questions related to how you can, with remote vote, preserve legitimacy, representation, safety of the procedure, have already been dealt with and already settled and solved beforehand. So it has been very useful right now not to have any kind of discussion in order to use the remote vote. And of course, we have been using it since the very beginning, and very safely, and very organized, because there has been a tradition. So no concerns about it in any way. The more general questions related to other general questions, most of the royal decree laws that have been approved, that have been passed during these several weeks, are related to economical and social matters. They are trying to solve very, very difficult situations that, due to the quarantine, we can say that in Spain are not affecting only the most vulnerable, who of course are more affected, but almost everyone, which is the main difference. It means the whole population of the country who is economically and socially affected by what is happening right now. So the government is working now on a minimum pay that will benefit everyone. It will be ready during this month, and it will pass to the parliament. We'll see how it goes, because we do not have many information about it now. And just yesterday, to end with this, reconstruction or recovery committee, special committee on the Congress, has been opened just yesterday, and it has been pushed by the government together with the opposition in order to work together in the economic and social recovery of the country. We'll see how it works. Yesterday it was only the formal opening of this committee of reconstruction.
Thank you. Leonardo and Sami, I would ask you to be brief if you can, so that we can have another set of questions, because there are a lot.
Sure. So I will address the 2 questions that were made specifically with Brazil in mind. But so were all our procedures thought for the pandemic? Yes. Actually, we are quite conservative when it comes to change in floor procedures in the House. They are quite complicated. The consequences are sometimes unforeseeable. And we, of course, we are not very comfortable with the idea of moving to a virtual environment in such a short time frame. But we actually had no option, because I agree with everyone that previously said that the better thing is Parliament stays open. So it gets chaotic. Oh, in regular sessions, it sometimes gets pretty chaotic, but now the power of the speaker is like very effective, because he has the mute all button. So he just hits the button if things get out of control, but they haven't been out of control during this period. These times have seemed to sober up pretty much everyone. So we are trying to address the problems in a very technical, objective, and way. We are trying to take into consideration very different perspectives, and I believe that the very important questions about how to protect vulnerable people and how to use like gender lenses to elaborate policies. We have seen a spike in violence, domestic violence against women in Brazil due to this period of social isolation. And we have a bill trying to cope with ways that will make it easier for women to denounce the violence that she is suffering inside her home. We also have, so how can Parliament remain relevant to make sure that vulnerable people are taken into account? They stay open. Like we have an indigenous representative, and she is like, she has been very helpful in making everyone understand what are the needs of indigenous people in Brazil and how can we elaborate public policies that will grant them the necessary protection during these times. So I think it's very important. I think that we're far from having it all figured out, but we are, I guess that we are on the right path so far. Thank you.
Tammy?
Right, so the bit about the similarities between virtual sitting and then the physical sittings, of course, I mean, virtual sitting can never be the same as the physical sittings. You would always have, you know, it will always come with its, you know, challenges. But and for me, I think that from a civil society perspective, if Parliament can sit physically, Parliament must sit physically. You know, virtual should be the exception rather than the rule. We must probably also explore more of these things, these virtual platforms for committee sittings, especially for countries where committees sit in camera. You know, countries where committee work, you know, does not gain the level of publicity as plenary work does gain. But the bit about minority groups and how they get affected, Parliament's work really is about everybody, and minority groups are part of the core group of people that Parliament must represent. You know, Parliament's work is about legislation, it's about oversight, and it's about representation. If they are legislating, they must legislate on issues and take into consideration the concerns of marginalized groups. If they are overseeing the work of the executive, the marginalized must be at the core of the oversight, you know, work that they do. And of course, if they are representing people, they are representing these marginalized groups. And so COVID-19, attention solely on COVID-19 at the detriment of all of the other works that must be done by Parliament, then marginalized groups will suffer tremendously. And for us as civil society parliamentary watchers, these are some of the things that we want to look out for and look out for more clearly. It is important to put this in the context of the examples that I cited from my continent of Africa, where, like I said, 30% of the 54 countries, you know, there are 54 countries in Africa. So our sampling of 16 makes it 30%, you know, of the countries that are currently on the continent. And like I said, from our study, 2 are doing virtual, but over 75% are actually sitting. They may not be virtual, but they are sitting. And in most of these sittings with a lot of restrictions. So there are some instances where in some of the countries, you know, less than 20% of members of Parliament are allowed into the chamber. You know, and I enumerated in my presentation some of the risk of doing these, because then if you say that only a certain number of people just to be able to meet the core modalities at the expense of the representational role of everybody, you know, within the country, representation of everybody within the country, which is a role that members of Parliament play, then it becomes a big issue. But I must say that, you know, out of the countries that we sampled, the parliaments are actually doing their very best to be able to understand the situation and even conform to it and try to find new ways around. And like I said from the very beginning, if there is any one thing that Parliament, especially those of us here on the continent of Africa, will learn, it is the fact that we must increase our preparedness for things like these, because we do not pray for a global pandemic of such proportion, but there will certainly be national issues require that parliaments will go virtual. And we must put in place measures to allow for these.
Thank you, Sammy. And thank you to all for your interesting answers to the questions. So we are exactly at the time we're supposed to finish, but we're going to extend for 15 more minutes if you are okay with sharing your time with us, because there's it could be interesting to have another round of questions. Of course, we're selecting them because some of them you have already addressed and some repeat themselves from people to person. So if you're okay, we can go ahead for some more minutes. Yes, good. So the first question, so we'll do the same methodology. I'll read the questions out and then you answer in the same order. So the first question is, will virtual parliamentary sessions not add extra budgetary cost to parliaments? Another question that wasn't so much addressed and really interesting is, how are the oversight control functions towards the executive of your parliaments working? And then I'm joining around 3 questions, more or less. In a context of virtual meetings, how have civil society organizations participated in the decisions taken by the floor? You addressed it, Mark, but maybe the rest can address those too. And how have interest groups participated in the legislative process? Then do online voting systems in your country during this period of pandemic still allow citizens to know how individual MPs vote on a specific matter? Leonardo, you addressed it, but maybe the rest can address it too. And related to this, you presented, addressed to Mark, Martha, and Leonardo, you presented successful experiences of plenary sessions that combine virtual elements and physical presence of key parliamentarians. Do you think that a plenary session in each of your countries could take place exclusively through virtual means? So going virtual 100%. Then let me, another question. Sorry, the last one. It's for Africa. How is Africa coping with the COVID-19 with so few ventilators available and lack of sanitizers? Some countries have ignored the physical distancing and are operating as business as usual. This is creating a great deal of problems in those countries. Has the African Union taken a universal stance of what to do? I would turn that into what are the parliaments doing regarding this? And the second side of the question is, you mentioned that only 2 countries in Africa have any measures related to online sitting. Having seen experiences in other countries, do you think that there are any incentives for other African parliaments to be able to continue functioning remotely through online sittings? You addressed it a little bit, but I think it's worth to explore a little bit more. And that's it for now. Thank you, and please be brief.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the questions. Yes, I'll be very brief, and I just want to also just to clarify on my point earlier. In Canada, we're fortunate to have a national TV broadcast, so if people don't have access to the internet, they could still view Parliament and committees through TV. So there's still that opportunity versus the broadcasting network. Cost-wise, for I mean, in Canada, there's a lot of we're saving a lot of money for traveling right now. So I haven't seen the numbers, but I don't think there's a significant budgetary item. There's technology issues that need to be purchased, obviously, with laptops and making sure all that is in place. So that's more of a longer term. As I mentioned in my presentation, we have 7 committees, and all 7 committees are receiving witnesses. I mentioned 160 on one committee on finance, but that's one of 7. So there's an opportunity for a lot of witnesses, a lot of civil society organizations to come in. As far as having it all virtual, that'll be challenging. There's no plans to do that. But like I said, our House and Procedures Committee will be reporting back to the House within 7 days to look at what can we do for virtual settings in the future. But as mentioned, you know, most parliaments are conservatives in the sense of standing orders are difficult to change, but hopefully some of the standing orders will be change, and this is my personal opinion, obviously making it more family friendly and making it you know, more with the gender lens. There's no doubt that has to be done. And possibly with virtual, that could happen. So, and from a yeah, budgetary cost, and so I'll leave it at that. Thank you. Merci.
Marta.
Okay, I'll try to be brief about the cost. If this costs much or more, the presidency has announced that 3 million euros that are saved from travel expenses from the members of parliaments will be given to COVID-19 assistance and research. So I think it is not more expensive, but less expensive in this case. About the executive control, I think there was a question about this. I think we are working less on that in the Spanish Parliament, and I think we must improve. There has only been one session, one control session of the government as a whole, and I think that is one issue that we must improve. About the participation of civil society in legislative work. Well, the legislative process has not changed. All groups, all parliamentary groups have virtual meetings every day, 5, 6, 7, with civil society in order to prepare amendments for the laws that are being worked and will be passed. So I think the work has not changed so far. And about transparency, all debates, all committees, and all the sessions are on television and on the internet. It was before and it is now. So I think transparency is complete in the case. And if a session could be organized and by virtual means 100%, I think it could happen, it might happen if it is needed, but I don't think it would be the same. That's my opinion. Anyway, if it is needed, I think we should try. If there's no other way to do our work, I think our work must be done above all.
Leonardo.
Well, thank you. And will virtual sessions cost more? No, they cost far less in Brazil. We have recently returned something around $30 million to the treasury, and the chamber is also committed to making this money useful for efforts against COVID-19. Is our oversight still working? Yes, it is working. As we moved to the virtual mode, we created a joint committee with 6 representatives and 6 senators that is in charge of keeping track of each and every initiative taken by the government to fight COVID-19. Civil society can still participate, and interest groups, they can still participate because many of the representatives in Brazil are doing just like Mark told us before. They are keeping meetings, virtual meetings of their constituencies. They are listening to what the people that are running big companies have to say, listening to what workers have to say. So people are getting the word out there. At the end of the day, it's not ideal. I totally agree with Sammy. Virtual sessions should be an exception. They should not be the rule. But people are able to get their word to the representatives so far. Transparency of the votes of each representative, oh, that works perfectly. We have taken several votes in the last month, and they are all public, and you can check and organize the votings by party, by state, and this is actually not a problem. And we are not prepared to go 100% virtual so far, because that will require us to mirror our infrastructure, everything that we have on the building online. So this is possible, but it has not been necessary, and I think that we're not quite ready to take that step so far. Thank you.
Sammy, sorry.
Right. Thank you. Let me say that on the bit about budgeting for Parliament going virtual, at least for the countries that we monitor parliamentary network. Africa, we know that, of course, some parliaments would have been very willing to have started some of these e-parliament initiatives a long time ago, but for budgetary constraints, because they have many conflicting, things that they need to allocate their budgets to. But like I said from the very beginning, maybe the good thing about this is that it will make more parliaments see why they must commit some more resource to some of these things going forward. And this has also shown other innovative ways that parliaments can engage with virtual sittings from how national parliaments across the world have done it. And so we may want to start adopting some of these measures, some of these less budget measures, easy to use measures, which has security concerns and what have you. On the bit about oversight controls of parliaments on the executive branch, I think that now more than ever, parliament's work, must be intensified around oversight, especially around these times when access to information is being restricted in many countries around the world, especially around these times when emergency procurement by the executive branch, may have semblances of corruption and what have you. Parliaments have a responsibility, to ensure that their oversight role is strengthened, to make sure that we do not come out of COVID-19 having realized that many bad water has gone down the drain while we're not watching and we're only focusing on the fight against COVID-19. When it comes to CSO and interest groups participation in the work of Parliament, of course, because of COVID-19, I've been confined to my home country of Ghana, and so I can speak specifically for now to cite Ghana examples here. The Parliament of Ghana has been sitting. It is not virtual, they are having physical sitting with some form of social distancing, but the Parliament of Ghana has over the years initiated live streaming of sittings of the House on its website and on Facebook with simultaneous sign language interpretation going on at every sitting day. So I am able to sit in my home where I've been working for a couple of weeks now and still monitor the work of Parliament and still take my notes and still go onto the parliamentary website and download the daily agenda and download the various papers that they are supposed to look at on there. So it is quite smooth, here in Ghana. But I must say that it is not same, in many parts of the continent, and perhaps is the very reason why the Ghana Parliament has actually received a lot of visits from other national parliaments to learn some of these, best practices in the past. Not necessarily, even before COVID-19 actually came up. And civil society have actually been monitoring. Civil society parliamentary monitoring organizations have a very good relationship with Parliament, and it hasn't been curtailed, even now. Of course, Africa, like any other continent, and African countries like any other country, has issues coping with COVID-19. The best of the world's medical systems, came crumbling to COVID-19. And so I think that it is not just peculiar to Africa, and parliamentarians on the continent, like parliamentarians, are also doing their bit to ensure that they can support their very people, out of these challenges. So I think that, to the best of my knowledge, some work is going on, and we must commend members of Parliament around these times. It's difficult. They have their own families. They are putting themselves on their families and themselves on the line. We must support them, and in supporting them, also make sure that we are holding them accountable at the same time for the work that they have committed to do. Now, let me clarify finally that in my presentation, as I said, and I think that the last question you posed to me, Maria, was talking about how two parliaments are doing virtual. Remember that we sampled 30% of African parliaments, so it is likely that the remaining 70 that we did not sample still had other, virtual working arrangements that we had not been able to touch on yet. Remember that this has all been happening within a very short period of time, and there is a limit to your ability to be able to sample, especially in the face of travel restrictions and some level of restrictions that are ongoing. But I think that the lessons from even these two and the lessons from the other countries around the world should be incentive enough for the parliaments who are not practicing these things and the parliaments who have not turned their eyes to these things to start looking and saying, oh, we think that this is the best time to be considering these matters, and we want to consider them now. In my country of Ghana, for example, the country has been looking at e-parliament for a long time as part of the entire e-governance, system, but implementation has been very, very slow. And I'm sure that if there is one thing that the managers of the parliament are actually looking at right now, it is how to fast track that particular process to ensure that, we don't find ourselves pants down in the future like we have now.
Thanks a lot, Sami. So we're in the last little segment of this conversation, a very interesting one indeed. So I would like to summarize some of the interesting points that you all collectively said, and some of the questions that were asked. I excuse and please pardon myself in front of the community that is still asking really interesting questions, but as a matter of time, we cannot address them all. So I would like to take a couple of minutes to highlight what we talked about. If we can divide what we talked about in sort of in and out, so in Parliament and outside Parliament, I think there's sort of interesting concerns or issues that were brought up and ideas that will continue to sort of pop in the next weeks, and hopefully in the next in the whole year, to be able to address those issues in the best way, and going to Sami's point, to enable other parliaments to do things that some have already done, and not trying to invent the wheel, to reinvent the wheel. So in the inside, or in the in part of what we talked about, I think it's interesting. There's 3 points that relate to the how. So how are we doing what we're doing? And I think the first one is how prepared parliaments are, or how prepared they were to come up to different solutions before the coronavirus world. And it's really interesting that the ones that have, and to Marta's point, it's a philosophical conversation too, as to how well you represent a specific constituency, or how well you do specific things that need more discussion rather than only going virtual, or how are you going to protect the privacy of the discussion of a specific vote, like Leonardo was saying, so you can access after the vote has already been casted, but not during. So the how, I think, the how you prepare has been key to some of the parliaments that are doing sort of interesting things in this world now. The second issue is and related to it, of course, is about privacy and security and technological sort of tools that the parliaments have or have come up with during these 2 months. And the third one, I would say how they're sitting, how these you're expressing in these 3 examples, more or less, that it's a system that has worked in your countries to do a mixed one, not all virtual, not all sitting or not presence, but a mixture of both. And as Marta says, and going to it's not only to address the pandemic, but also to address other issues. And that brings me to sort of who. So the parliamentarians also have issues in these, not Spain, but Brazil, Canada, and many countries are big. It enables us to not have to, or the parliamentarians not have to travel as much, like Mark was saying, the family-friendly sort of atmosphere also for the representatives, and to enable them to be more active in their own atmospheres where they are located. And I think it's also about an issue of representation. You can be closer to your constituents as well. And the last point also it's about the what. So what they produce or what the parliaments come up with. So the agenda, I would name it the agenda. And this concern about, is this a COVID agenda only or an emergency agenda only, or also an agenda that addresses all the other issues, going to Sami's point about the vulnerabilities that our societies have, and how in the back of the whole agenda is that how are the parliaments addressing those issues that are still, that have continued to be an agenda for the past maybe 40 years in some cases or more. And so I think those are really interesting points that have come up in the conversation. And then if we go into the so who or how the parliaments relate to while they're working in this strange new world. And I, of course, would divide it into who and how. So how do they, bring and come up with the participation? And I think the Canadian example is a really great one. Not only sort of to tick the box of participating or allowing people to hear what the Parliament is saying, but also to engage. And so the fact that people bring evidence of COVID today, but tomorrow on other things, of what is happening, I think it's really powerful because it opens sort of a new way of engagement, a more real and a way to connect with our societies in a more constructive way, because there's a lot of knowledge there and that Parliament can benefit from, and then get back to society with what they decide. And also, and Sami addressed it a little bit about the interest groups as well. And so how the interest groups are being connected to Parliament in these times, and how there needs to be sort of a transparency around that, around the connection of the interest groups during these times, because you can shut off the rest of society too. And then the final point about who, and we addressed it earlier, about who is civil society. And for us, today is the civil society that is only connected, that is ticking the box of the participation, or how are we managing to engage with the communities that are still behind and that are not connected. In the case of Brazil, there's a strong, and Leonardo mentioned it, there's a strong group of people that are in that situation. Latin America, of course, Canada as well, and there needs to be, I think, sort of a recalibration of that. That's it for me. So 3 more things, and I'll let you go. One is that I want to thank the partners of Open that are here, behind the scenes, answering, and WhatsApp. This is going mad, and so NDI, ODIR, WFD, Directorio Legislativo, the Latin American Network for Legislative Transparency, and Parlamericas, of course. And one last thing, you know that this session is under the umbrella of the Open Gov Week that is organized by the Open Government Partnership. And within this umbrella of Open Gov Week, we have launched, or we are launching right now, that's the news, what we are calling the 2020 conversation. And the 2020 conversation is around what conversations, or some more philosophical, some more concrete, can we have about the role of parliaments as institutions that can make our societies a better place. And so we're taking this whole year to discuss that, because we think that this time of confinement in some cases, isolation in others, can give us an opportunity to have conversations that we've in the previous world, that very hectic one, it didn't have the time to celebrate. And so I invite you all to the next 3 conversations. We don't have a date yet, but the next conversations are going to be really, really interesting. The first one is going to be around youth, and how can youth communities in the different countries engage, bring knowledge, and participate in parliament and with the parliamentarians, engage in the agenda. That's one set. The other one is a conversation with African communities, and how can we step up in the engagement with African civil society and parliamentarians. The third one is going to be one really, really related to this world today. And we are going to ask some members of or chairs of health committees in some countries to be able to come and discuss together with us around the role in the pandemic world, and how has been the relation specifically with the executives and the parliament as a whole. What has been, is it budget allocations, is it authorizations, is it new ideas on how to approach the pandemic, things like that. So you're all invited, and without further ado, I release you. Good. So people are disengaging. Good. Thank you so much. The 4 of you, been great. This is a very bad thing for you. I have your phone numbers. And so
thank you, Maria.
You'll be reconnected.
Thank you very much, Maria.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you, Maria.
Great job.
Bye-bye
Great job,
to
everyone.
all.
Take care.
Bye.